Hello. In today's video, we'd like to show you how to implement the MAM SDK for local auth for a Citrix endpoint management service. The agenda of this video is to show you the basics of data flow, including the NetScaler. It's important for enrollment and just getting the basics of MAM up and functioning since it does pass through the NetScaler if you have it in place. We'll talk to you about the MAM SDK core and make sure you've got those pieces in place. This video doesn't cover that, but it's important that you're aware of it. We'll also take you through the MAM SDK setting up the local auth inside your application. So we assume your application is already created and you're just augmenting it with our SDK. We'll then show you the policy configuration inside the endpoint management console in the cloud, and then we'll take you through testing that and debugging it on the device. So it's important that you understand the basic data flow inside the service. So with the endpoint management service, you typically have cloud connectors installed in your network and a NetScaler or Citrix gateway. And the idea is that the cloud connectors are there so that the cloud service can talk to Active Directory, or if you have certificate integration embedded into your service, then it's there. And also if you have virtual apps and desktops configured, the enumeration of those apps inside of Secure Hub would come through the cloud connector as well. So when you talk about device management side of the house and policy management, for example, those basic configurations go from the device to the endpoint management service and talk, and then if you need to authenticate, they go through the cloud connector. But the difference is that your client data, so the data that would typically be traversing from your application, right, going into internal web services, web pages, etc., inside your network, that will pass through the gateway. So that traffic doesn't traverse through the cloud and go through the cloud connectors. They go direct from the device to the gateway. So it's important that you know that there's a web page for developers to go and look at information about the MAM SDK, and depending on the platform that you're using or the framework that you're using, the links you would take would vary, right? So in our case, we're looking at iOS and iPad. So we're actually doing our app in Swift. So first thing we want to do is drill into the iOS and iPad overview. And this walks you through a bit of things around, the information about the various pieces of the SDK. For the sake of what we're doing today and getting started, there's the integration of the basic SDK for getting the framework set up and ready in your application. So that's not part of this video. We created a basic overview video that takes you through getting Xcode set up, getting the framework integrated, and getting those pieces going. So if you've not viewed that and you're watching this video, there's a previous video, if you haven't seen it, that you've missed, and you need to go back and get Xcode and the framework and the core into your application. Once you've done that, you can then go through some information around how do you set up various pieces of it. In this case, we've clicked on compliance. But there's others around containment, a micro VPN to gain access into the network, and local authentication. And obviously, we're focusing on local authentication today. So there's a bit in here on getting started that kind of shows you the information about getting the framework into your application, etc., and getting the core set up and doing all those things. And you see there's Objective-C and Swift examples as well. And so while there's also some information here, if you look, you can drill down. There's also a local authentication at the bottom where you go through and it tells you information about what is app passcode and max offline period and various things around that. And we'll go a bit more into that as we get into the SDK and start implementing into our app and showing you how it works. It talks a little bit about the delegate and some methods and attributes that you can read and use in your application. And there's some further information down here around the inactivity timer. So if you know if connectivity needs to connect back to the service, is that's about to expire. And there's some pieces in the framework that'll automatically prompt the user when that's getting down to 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and 5 minutes. So good resource for you for basic reading here. And we'll go through and take this information and integrate it into our app, and you'll see how easy that's done. So one of the first things we do is get into Xcode. And before we do anything, we just want to make sure that our application works. We've got the core integrated. You can see I've got a few other classes derived here, but ultimately, we don't have the local authentication integrated yet. So let's just go ahead, and I've gone ahead and just select my iPad here, and you see the iPad here on the right, and we're just going to run this and just make sure it comes up and kind of behaves what we expect it to do. So we've been offline for a bit here, so we need to make sure that we sign on. So what we should see happen here is it should just switch back to Secure Hub and make sure we have a login, and we'll continue on. Okay, so now that we've got everything validated, this is what we expect. This app essentially just connects in and connects into a Windows server that's just basically running IIS. So what we want to do now is integrate the local authentication SDK into our application. So we're going to import CTX MAM Local Auth, and we want to derive our class. We're going to go ahead and add that in, the SDK delegate. And then we have our delegate methods that we need to implement inside our class. So what we see here is we've got some information about device passcode is required. So if the device doesn't have a passcode on it, we will get a prompt here. And normally what you would do is, if this happens, you would have your application exit because it shouldn't continue on without the device secured. Max offline period is a value that says it's a hard fixed time that's defined in your policy that we'll talk a bit about later. And essentially it says if someone were to get on a plane or just be using the app and it never connected back to the endpoint management service, how long will we let that go before we say, hey, you can't use this app anymore, let it go? And then max offline period will exceed warning is a delegate that basically says at 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and 5 minutes, when you're approaching that period where you're hitting about to exceed the max offline period, it starts warning the user to sign on. So we're going to implement the part about this device passcode and go through that example here. But the max offline period, it'll auto switch to Secure Hub and force the user to log on if we already hit that time period. So we've got the delegates inside of our application. And now what we need to do is we need to set the delegate for the local auth. So for part of the framework, we want to go ahead and paste that in. And at this point, we need to go ahead and go to product and build the application. Okay, and now that our build succeeded, we need to take that application or the MDX file that defines the policies for our application, and we need to import that into the endpoint management console. Okay, so now that we want to upload our MDX files, sometimes depending on your Xcode configuration, you may not be able to find your MDX file easily. So one of the things you can do is inside of Xcode, you can go into project settings, and inside of here, you will see an option for project relative location. And it may not be set to that. It may be default location or custom, but if you put it to project relative, then it will be buried inside of your application. So what we would do is just do a build of the application. And then if we go to Finder and you look inside of my application, since we set it to relative, there'll be a build, release iPhones, and here is the MDX file. So what we want to do is take this file and load it into the endpoint management console. And the reason we do that is that this MDX file is essentially XML that defines what the policies are for the app, and it assigns the app and its policies to certain users. So it ensures that the user, when they enroll their device and load the application, they get the policies defined to the app, and it doesn't just use the defaults with essentially nothing turned on. Right? So what we need to do is then go to our Cloud Console, and I've already logged in and clicked on the Manage button under Endpoint Management. And so what we want to do is then go into Configure and Apps. And I've already got it loaded here, but I'll show you how to actually do an update if you were to make a change to the config. So you go ahead and select the app or choose Add here if you didn't have one already, give it a name. And then inside of here, you would select upload and then browse to that location that we just saw inside of Finder. Now, I've already got it loaded here for the sake of its speed and time. But if you were to make some changes, you could just upload an MDX file and it'll just merge or remove anything that is no longer relevant based on your config. So there's a few things you want to look at here. And one of them is max offline period. And if you remember when we looked inside of Xcode, there was this exceeded max offline warning, right? And so the default for this is 168 hours, which is essentially 7 days. And that's what a lot of customers use, right? But it's important to note that this max offline period is not activity based. So if I were to enroll my device and get this app on my device and were to get the policy now, it would be exactly 7 days from now when that app would stop working. And so just a good thing to note, if there are other things inside the product that are activity based, this value is not. And you can certainly drop this down to 1 hour if you wanted, and we'll actually set it to that here for the sake of our demo. And there are a few other pieces in here. Device passcode should be turned on. In my config here, there's an app passcode, but that actually doesn't do anything, right? When you use the MAM SDK, the only passcode that is used is the device operating system passcode. It doesn't use the same PIN and passcode that would be used for things like secure mail and secure web if you used that before, right? It relies strictly on the device OS. And it's important to note that your custom applications running with your signed certificate and everything will not play in the same time or space as the native apps that Citrix produces because they're signed by a separate certificate. So important to note that you turn those on. Another is to allow app after warning, right? In that if you've messed up in implementing something inside your SDK implementation, it may give you a warning, but it won't just kill the app and stop you from continuing on down the road. And so those are the kind of the key things that we really need to be aware of. The other is their approvals. So typically most people don't use this, but you can do workflows. So it can look inside of Active Directory and identify who is your manager. And then if you needed access to this app, it would then send the request to your manager. Your manager could then accept it and allow you, and then the app would push to you. So for that reason, a lot of people don't use it, but it is something that's there. So by default, just people don't use that workflow, especially if you're developer testing. Now, the other is delivery groups. And delivery groups are a way to logically group things inside of the Endpoint Management Service console. And what it allows you to do is there's an all users delivery group. So that just means anyone that enrolls a device will get this application. And this is great for developers, probably not so great in the real world where only certain people are going to get access. And what you can do is inside of the delivery groups, let me go ahead and save that. So if you want to do this inside of a production environment and limit your testing to just the developers or a set of test groups, right, you can define a delivery group, and we can just pick one of these here, for example, and edit it. And what you'll see is assignments here. And so you can search your Active Directory for domain users, for example, or Zen mobile test users, right? And what this will do is it will go search your AD in your domain and find that group. And so then when a user goes to, if you assign this delivery group to a set of users, only your test users would get access to that application. All right, we're not going to make that change here, but it's good to know. And so now that we've got this implemented, let's go ahead and rerun our app and look and see what happens and what we see in the logs. So now we've gone back to Xcode, and you notice we've set some breakpoints here. We're going to go ahead and debug our app again, and you see that the max offline period is being highlighted here. So we've essentially made sure we've exceeded our max offline period, and we've disabled the app passcode on the device. So what we would expect to see here when we run the debugger is that we immediately stop here saying, hey, device passcode required. So normally in this situation, what you would do is have your app essentially exit here, warn the user, hey, you need to set a passcode, and then exit. So now we continue on, and you notice now it's telling us, hey, the max offline period has been exceeded. So we know that our app should be prompting us to reestablish our Secure Hub token. And it'll stop here a couple of times if you haven't done this. And notice it's also given us a compliance alert as well. And now prompting us to reestablish our PIN to log in so that the max offline period inactivity timer is reset. So now you see that since we didn't implement and make the app exit, the SDK is forcing us to do it, and then it's trying to reestablish a connection here to the gateway, which is essentially what's going on. So now we've expanded Xcode so we can look at the logs a little bit more in depth here. And what you'll notice here is it's good to go through and look at these and kind of learn what are normal warning messages so that the SDK is trying to establish, for example, is the Citrix Workspace app, which is this Citrix receiver that you would see there as the message, but essentially the Workspace app. So, what are the common things that are normal here, and it's okay for those to be there, and what are the things that we are logging, and what do we expect to see in these logs? And so if you go back here and you look, right, you see it's looking for, is the Workspace app here. That's important for if you've got that integration turned on. In my environment, that's not there, so that's a normal message here. We also see this in its URL error, and that's essentially because the max offline period is exceeded. So since it's telling us, hey, I can't let you log in because you've not established security on the device. And then we see a bit of these errors in my logging that you see in our code here up at the top, is I'm saying, hey, the max offline period was exceeded. I had some features for the ability to block the camera and things like that for containment, so that's turned on, so some logging there. And a few errors here about the gateway, and again, we expect to see those since we weren't logged in properly. This is the micro VPN feature turned on, so it's saying, hey, I see you're trying to access this stuff and what filters are turned on and those sorts of things. And then you'll see a bunch of these swizzling notifications, and that's the SDK injecting itself in to intercept various API calls that the MDX policies are supposed to protect against. So a lot of normal stuff here, and you'll see a number of these swizzling features, and then your SDK core initializing the various components of the SDK. So if you've got all those things turned on, hey, what is it turning on? What is it not, right? So depending on what pieces of the framework you implement, you may or may not see these turned on. So, and then a bunch of swizzling here is essentially what the rest of these are. So good little thing to get familiar with. Learn what's right what's there when your app is functioning properly, and learn, break some things during the development cycle. Pay attention to these and really understand, what these messages mean and what's normal and what isn't.